Thank you, everybody, for being here, and I am so excited to be here. I am here with PJ Charles
Hey, PJ.
and Joffrey Harris, and we're here to talk about racial reconciliation, and our series has been called Lead with Love, and we're here just to have another messy, honest, authentic conversation about racial reconciliation.
Thanks for kicking us off there, buddy. PJ, we're really glad to have you again. Last time we
Thank you.
talked about the problem,
Right.
but we had so much to say, we didn't get to the solution.
Indeed, yeah. Time really fast flies when you're passionate about what you're talking about.
I know. It sure does. Well, we talked about the problems of racism, injustice,
Right.
and you shared some very, very good stories. The fear factor for you when you were pulled over by a white police officer and had your 3 children in the back seat, and just what that did to you emotionally, and I think a lot of Caucasians don't think about that at all. You know, it's
right.
You know, they're thinking worst case, I'm going to get a ticket. Right. So I appreciate your insight, and this really for me is a learning session.
Right.
I think we have to ask all the questions, or not all the questions, but most of the questions, before we start forming opinions and sharing advice with people. We need to really be able to have both sides of the story. It's like being on jury duty.
Right.
You know, you can hear one side and say, "Oh boy, I'm ready to convict." You know.
That's right.
But the judge always informs you, don't make a decision yet.
That's right.
So
That's right.
We talked a little bit about the idea of leading with love, and that God's love is really the primary solution to hate and racial ignorance and injustice. And so we want to spend most of our time talking about that today.
Okay.
I know that you've had other situations where you have experienced injustice. Can you share with us another example, and maybe how how God led you to be able to deal with it and continue to lead with love?
Well, I mean, when you talk about injustice, it's important to express that I am and I can only speak for myself. I'm not a person who likes to assess a situation and determine that race is the motivating thing. I will exhaust all other issues. I will limit it to the fact that maybe he just doesn't like me. You know what I mean? Yeah. I will, try my best to be discerning, and when I'm assessing someone's behaviors and their approach towards me. Jock, you know me. You know I always lead with love in any conversation. Excuse me, close that door, please. With any conversation, thank you. Any approach, any introduction, love is always my motivation there. And so the injustice part, a lot of times, and some people will use the race as a defense mechanism and say, here it is. I prefer to deflect. Scripture says you don't cast your pearls to pigs. I've been using that phrase a lot in the last 2-3 days. And it's not an insult. What it basically means is don't engage if you don't believe you have the person's ear. And so I'm not going to waste a lot of time trying to convince you if your mind's made up. And so when it comes to injustice, I really believe it's perception. If I allow myself to feel like I'm facing an injustice, then it's injustice, you know. However, that's not how I lead, you know. I'm a firm believer that a lot of people have a backstory, right? And so a lot of times you have to be willing to accept that, even if you don't know what the backstory is, you know, and then allow that to lead with love. So perfect example is, and I'll keep this one brief. My wife is white. She's half Polish, half German. And when I met her, it was immediate. I fell in love. It was like that, those rom-com movies, and it was love at first sight. Her grandfather, not so much. He didn't really think that. It's so when her grandfather was a third generation German, you know, from German immigrant. His grandfather came here, started a meat smoking business in Rogers City, Michigan, very, very small town, 2,500 people. And so, you know, he did not have a lot of experience with Black people. And so when I first met her grandmother, it was equally love at first sight. Me and this woman became best friends. I mean, I can't even tell you about our scope of our relationship. Joff, you know who Helen Plath is. You remember her.
You bet, huh?
And so I did not shake hands and have a face-to-face conversation with Angela's grandfather until the weekend of our wedding. Because if I was coming in the front door, he was going out the back. I mean, it was that broad. And so again, I could have been angry, I could have been hostile, I could have been any number of things. However, I just took it to say, hey, you know, I know his background. I know he's from a small town. I know the only exposure he has to Black people is what he sees on the news. And we already know that's not good. Right. And so it didn't make it right, but I understood. And can I tell you that, you know, after that meeting, Mo, which is what everybody called him, we became best friends. We spent mornings at Jack and Mary's eating breakfast. We played cards together. He actually died from a stroke, fell out of a shower, and I was the one beating on his chest performing CPR, and he died with me straddling. So I'm glad we became friends, because otherwise that would have been a horrible way for him to go out. But
that's funny.
But at the
what a picture!
What a picture! What a picture!
Oh.
And so I'm glad that we became great friends at the end of it all. But again, it was the backstory, right? It was his history. It was his learned behavior. And he took all of that and decided at the onset that he didn't want to know who I was.
Right.
However, I had invaded his world, and so he didn't really have much of a choice. So
that's right. Yeah. Well, you know, people are drawn to Christ by his love.
Yes.
And hopefully, if we reflect that love, you know, people will be drawn to that in us.
Right.
And I'm sure I was sure, knowing you, that was what got his attention.
Yeah, I would not relent. He didn't have a choice in the matter. He was outnumbered. He was outloved. The whole gambit. Yeah, there was no way we weren't going to become friends. So
yeah.
And PJ, besides with the grandparent, there are grandchildren involved eventually. So
right, exactly. And he loved the kids, and
right.
You know, and I think at the end of the day, he really just realized, you know, I loved his granddaughter, and
right.
You know, it was my aim and my goal in life to love her with everything that I had and to take care of her. And that was obvious. So, you know, he had to succumb to that and just accept it. And then, like I said, we became great friends. So.
Well, that's great. You basically thought the best in that situation. And oftentimes we offer platitudes like that. Oh, just think the best.
Right.
You know,
right.
It's not that easy sometimes, though.
It's not, you know, again, like I said, I have a perspective where God has allowed me to have relationships at early on in my life with people from different backgrounds, different cultures. You know, when I was in high school, my friendship base was a melting pot.
Right.
And we had a lot of different friends, and that just expanded as I got into college. So, you know, the black and white issue always remained gray for me. And again, this is just a personal experience because I had real, genuine, authentic friends, you know, that would, you know, take a bullet for me proverbially, you
Right.
know. And so, you know, it made the racial divide not so much a divide. Again, for my personal experience, because I've seen the best from people from
Right.
in all colors, you know, and so um, and as a pastor, I'm not really allowed to feel that way either because God had uniquely placed me in predominantly white churches um, through my entire adulthood. And so, and I always had a leadership position in one way or another. I had always been sought out. And so, um, I never had to feel this burden or wonder, you know, why I wasn't being treated this way or why I wasn't, you know, being treated another way. You know, I remember I took my first youth trip that I planned on my own was to Atlanta, and I always laughed, and I was just like, you know, it's one black guy. The majority of my group leaders were white. The majority of my students were white. And I took them to College Park, Atlanta, which is like one
Oh,
of the scariest places. They call it Popo Alley, and not because of the police. They call it Popo Alley because of the gunshots. And that's where we
right.
did ministry. And I'm like, these white families are entrusting their babies to me, and I'm taking them here. I was like, this is horrible.
Well, they didn't know.
Yeah.
They
Well,
just
I didn't
did.
hide it, but you know, it says a lot to me about just the power of Christ and the power of the family of Christ when people indeed see you as a person as opposed to a statistic, you know.
Right.
It would be just as easy for me to walk on eggshells through my church wondering who's judging me and who's thinking this
Right.
of me, who's thinking that, and that would deter the work that God had ordained me for, right?
Yeah.
And in the same instance, and there have been families that have approached me with apprehension and with fear or disdain, and that's their loss because if they don't understand that you know I exist to pour into their family and to pour into their children, then they don't get the benefit of why God has placed me in leadership in church. And so, but again, I'm relentless, and so more times than not, you know, things end in the way they're supposed to. So,
Hey, PJ, I have a question, and
hmm
the question is about you gave two excellent examples of building bridges.
hmm
I
hmm
mean, I picture you might be too young for this, but guess who's coming to dinner? Sidney
oh yeah,
Poitier.
no,
Yeah,
Sidney Poitier, yeah, I've seen
yeah,
it.
that's you and Grandpa.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
mean, I can relate. That's a tense situation,
hmm
equally uncomfortable for you and him. He
Yes,
didn't know what else to do other than go out the back door,
right.
which might have been the nicest thing he knew to do.
Yep,
I'm not
exactly
defending
right.
him, but that might have
Yeah,
been the only thing he knew to do
that's right.
because he was afraid. So, but
hmm
and the example of you taking the kids in the youth group to Atlanta. I mean, can you get really specific about things, something that I can take away, or a listener
hmm
can take away, things you actively did and maybe that were reciprocated in those two situations? Because that's real to me. Guess
Okay,
Who's Coming to Dinner was just a movie, but man,
right,
it was a reality for you.
right. Um, I think the first thing with Angela's grandfather was I had to be intentional about dispelling any myths or wrong misconceptions that he had about Black people, right? And
Okay.
so that began immediately with just how I carry myself, with how I speak, and I mean, and that's
Okay.
again, that's me. I'm a learned individual. You know, I read tons. I know a lot about a lot. You know, and so I can carry a conversation about almost anything. You know, also I think leading, you know, being Christ-centered is huge. You know, I think having a
Right.
biblical worldview cannot be denied in any conversation. Not with somebody who considers themselves a Christian anyway. They could push back, but at the end we have to understand that we agree on a certain point, you know, and that certain point it should be, you know, paramount in our lives. You know, that's our faith. And so with Mo, it really just began with that, with him observing and recognizing, wow, everyone else in my family loves this guy. There's a reason for that. So what turned to his initial, you want to say disdain, I don't want to say disgust, turned to curiosity. Because his wife, like I said, was my best friend. Like, I mean,
Right.
I cannot kid you about that at all. I mean, I spent a summer after he passed in a nursing home with her. I rented out an apartment in the nursing home, and I was there for
Wow.
2.5 weeks because my wife knew I needed a sabbatical and I needed a break, and I didn't know what to do. And she said, go hang out with Graham. And that's what I did. I got an apartment in the nursing home, and for 2.5 weeks, we drove around Petoskey, Michigan, and sat at the lake and had conversations and Bible studies and ate at all the restaurants and window shopped and just talked and laughed. I love that woman with everything. And so, so when he saw those relationships fostering, it was kind of like that, like that Tom Sawyer kind of a thing where, you know, where whitewash the fence. This is great, you know.
Sure. Right. I get it.
You're really gonna enjoy painting this fence. Come on in, you know. That
And
kind of thing.
in that process, and a part that maybe you don't know all the conversations, but in that process, seems like grandmother was quite the bridge builder.
Oh, she was huge. She would
Yeah.
say time and time again, I cannot believe you're going to ignore this person who your first grandchild loves,
Right.
that you're not going to be a part of her life with this man in it, and you're going to miss out on all the things that God has stored. God has blessed her with this man, and you're missing it. I mean, she would run him through the ringer almost daily. So yeah. And then another story is when we were in Atlanta. Oh, this one's crazy. So I have two students, two young girls. It was my lead pastor's daughter and her best friend. And we made a plan that every morning they had a Starbucks in the hotel. So we were just all, you know, just crazed over that. And so we decided every morning we would get up before everyone else, and just the three of us, we would go down for coffee every morning, just to sit, just to talk about the trip, you know, just spend that quality time. They weren't just my youth group students at that time. I was also their teacher. I taught middle school, high school Bible at this private Christian school at the time.
Oh, wow.
And so we would go down. Now, a lot of people do this. They give fake names at Starbucks for their, right?
Right.
And so, but now I have to go back and say we're in downtown Atlanta. So the entire workforce in downtown Atlanta is Black. And one of the young girls walks up, we're doing the drink orders, and the girl goes, name, and she goes, Shaniqua. And I'm mortified. I'm completely mortified because the woman looks up and she doesn't look at her, she looks at me. And because we all know her name's not Shaniqua, right? And I'm sitting there and I'm wrapping my brain around this, and she doesn't even notice how upset the woman is, you know? And I pulled her aside and I said, you can't do that. And she looks up at me with all the innocence in the world, and she goes, why, Mr. C? It's just a name. And I said to her, I was like, we'll have to talk about this later, because right now, honestly, I didn't want to make a scene. I didn't want
Right.
to embarrass her. I didn't want to, here's a line, but then I've got this Black woman behind the counter looking at me like, first of all, what are you doing with these 2 white girls? And then
Exactly.
how are you going to let her, embarrass me like this? Very, very touchy, very, very delicate situation. However, later that day, we were supposed to do a trip to this certain place, but the pastor there, one of the plans fell through. So instead, he got us all into the Center for Civil Rights Museum. And these 40 kids, I don't think one of them left the building without crying. They learned things that school, and this is so unfortunate, that schools just don't teach.
Right.
Right. And I think that's one of the biggest problems in our country is that America will not admit to their crimes, and they won't teach it. And so this blissful ignorance continues to grow and to manifest itself. And it happens in the school systems, because, oh yeah, there was slavery and slavery was bad. Oh yeah, the civil rights movement was bad. Here's just a 30-second clip. And then let's move on with our curriculum. Right. And they'll spend more time on the Holocaust that happened in Germany than they will on what happened here in America, right? Kids know so much more about the Holocaust than they do about the civil rights movement here, right? Which is part of
slavery in America embarrasses us.
Right.
It's not a conversation we want to have.
Right.
It's too close to home. It's too real.
Exactly. However, in Germany, as early as 3rd grade, they take the kids out to the camps, into the ovens, and they show them Schindler's List, because history will repeat itself if you don't learn it.
I agree.
Right? And so, but anyway, I digress. And so we come out of the Civil Rights Museum, and these kids they had the counter experience. They had to put their headphones on, and they had to put their hands on the kitchen counter. Remember when they did the counter riots? At the store, right? And then and so they had to see how long they could sit there with people screaming and yelling obscenities and curses in their, in their ears, while not moving their hands from the counter. And I've watched kids throw off the headphones and just sobbing and crying. And then after the fact, we all sat out on the lawn outside and and they were like, well, Mr. C, did this ever happen to you, And then I began to share as early as 14 years old in New York, different stories and they're looking at me and they're like, well, why? Why would they do this to you? I had to explain to them, I said, you guys see me as your pastor. You see me as your teacher. You see me as your mentor. You see me as your friend. I said, none of that matters when I get in my car. To certain people. And I had to continue to reflect that to certain people. This isn't a global thing. You can't just compartmentalize a lump of people into this, And so I was able to double back and say, now let me tell you why you used that name Shaniqua and you used it flippantly, and the name might sound funny rolling off your tongue, and that's why you used it. However, that person behind the counter probably knows somebody with that name.
Yes.
And it's not funny. It's not insulting. It's someone's name. And you used it in a callous way because it is a predominantly Black name. You using it almost appeared as if you were mocking her. Yes. And she just, exploded in tears. And it was this huge thing. But it was a lesson. It was a build bridge. It was just another brick in that bridge, right? And so I thanked God over and over and over again for allowing opportunities like that for these children and allowing me to be the one that was able to lead that. We went back to Atlanta 2 more times, 2 more summers after that, because the kids just wanted to go back. They wanted to see what gentrification looked like in real life, which we did. They wanted to see what the school systems look like in poorer areas, which we did. They wanted to see the difference between HSBUs, the historically Black colleges. We toured a couple of those campuses and they saw the differences there. We went to some of the poorest neighborhoods, and did cookouts in them, and invited people out, and they saw what they expected to be hostility. What they saw instead was fear. Like, people in these neighborhoods are like, why are all these white people here? Like, what is happening, you know? And they were apprehensive to approach. And so they knew, they really got to see that on both lines, there's so many misconceptions. There's so many inherent fears that have been taught through generations. And all of them, you know, for the most part, are mythical, and that no one's looking at each other as people. Instead, they're looking at each other through this list of traits and things that they've learned through media and the news and through stories, and just lies, honestly.
Yes.
You know, so it was a great learning experience, you know.
Hey, PJ and Joffrey, if you don't mind, I want to interject just a little story here, because it's you hit me right between the eyes there, PJ, and it's real. About 2 months ago, I started reaching out to some people that I saw on podcasts that were rather outspoken, and I joined one group, UNR community on Facebook, Unity and Reconciliation. And my job there is just to listen. You know, we've invited you, you don't speak, you just listen. And then, which is a great position for a white guy to be in today. I mean, I'm just going to use the term white and black because that's how I see it. And my job is to go there and just listen. And one thing I became aware of is I have blind spots. But let me explain a blind spot in terms that I can understand it. Like your Shaniqua story, it's excellent.
Right.
That girl meant no harm.
No, she didn't. No.
But have you ever been on a motorcycle, PJ? You like motorcycles?
Yeah. Okay. I like them. Yeah.
I love them. In high school, my first one, age 16, was a Yamaha 100 twin jet. I rode that thing like a bat out of Panera bread. I rode it crazy, and I got crazy, and I'm alive today, and I don't know why, but I love that bike. And then the second bike I got was a road bike, and my wife and I took vacations on it.
Nice.
But my point being is, here I am. I'm a bike rider. I love bikes and I respect cyclists. But you know where I'm headed with this, and with the term blind spot. I'm driving in my car. I'm looking at the rear view window, a mirror, and I'm looking at the two side mirrors. And I cautiously turn on my left-hand turn signal to move, go in the left lane. And twice in my life, I've nearly killed a cyclist. No, nearly, and they gave me the friendly wave with the middle finger, and I had no intention of harm.
Right.
But I'm sitting there, I look carefully, rear view mirror, side mirrors, and I turn around and look. In the older cars, you have this big post in the middle, and you cannot see that motorcycle. You can't see it, period. But that's the best illustration I have of a blind spot.
Right.
As a youngster, I could hear and tell watermelon jokes. That's in it. But I had no idea that could offend someone. I had no idea. It was just a funny joke. Everybody laughs. Not everybody laughs because it's funny. Some people laugh because it's not safe to not laugh. Well, right? You're in a certain crowd. You laugh at their jokes because you want to walk out alive.
Right.
But and I'm sorry it takes so long to explain that, but that's the best illustration I've ever had of a blind spot. And your young youth girl had no malice in her heart whatsoever. But she couldn't see what she couldn't see. She couldn't hear what she couldn't hear. She doesn't know what she doesn't know. And I just wanted to say today, we all have blind spots, and we don't know where they are, PJ.
Right. And so, both of those stories are on opposite sides of the pendulum, right? So with my wife's grandfather, it was intentional ignorance, right? And with the young lady, it was blissful ignorance.
Right.
However, the result and the solution is the same, and that's education. Right. The education has to come from someone that's on the other side, that's willing to educate, you know? And so that's one of the problems that we have right now is, you know, everybody wants to support, but then nobody's going to educate, you know? And then a lot of people are putting up posts and they're putting up all of these things and they're adding fuel to their opinion. However, they're not doing research.
Exactly.
Right.
Yes.
And so a lot of people
Mhm.
are and this is where the ignorance is unacceptable, quite honestly, because,
Yes.
you know, if you want to shout from the mountaintops, you ought to be educated about what you're shouting, you know, or don't shout.
Ex-
You
Listen,
know.
listen.
Mhm.
You bet. You
Because
know,
I look at your grandfather and I think too, what I see there might be different than what you felt when you first met him. I see fear in him.
Mhm.
He
Mhm.
didn't know what to do.
Yeah. Mhm.
He didn't know what to do. Uh, and he probably wasn't even aware of his level of fear.
He knew what he was doing.
Oh, really? Oh,
He was
okay.
not, yeah, he was not happy. He
I,
was not.
I'm not trying to justify his bad behavior. I'm just saying that
Oh no,
I,
no, I
I
get
have
it.
done things out of fear before
Yeah,
because I didn't know what to say.
yeah. No, he did not want to engage at all.
Oh, okay. All
uh,
right.
No, yeah, it was pretty obvious where he was coming from. But
but
but like
you know,
again,
it's really interesting. You know, part of our ministry of natural discipleship is
mm-hmm,
to help believers engage
mm-hmm,
uh, in relationships.
right, mm-hmm,
You know, God's great commandment was to love Him and to love others.
that's
Now
right,
that wasn't the great suggestion. You
mm-hmm,
know,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm, that's right,
it was the great commandment.
right,
And to your point, Alvin, certain situations, and a lot of our training is about how do you engage people in respectful dialogue.
right,
How do you think the best of them in the power of God's Spirit when you don't feel it emotionally, but you do it by faith? You know, how do you engage people with the attitude of, I want to be obedient to God and His Word? You
right.
know, I have a perspective, they have a perspective, but the only perspective that really matters is God's perspective.
Well, I kind of want to go back to Alvin's, you know, assessment that Mo was responding out of fear, because it's entirely possible, right? So fear
Right.
usually, you know, a lot of things are manifested out of fear. Usually it's
Right.
anger. You have a
Right.
fight or flight response, and uh, and so Isaiah, through this entire time, through since Ahmaud Arbery, I've been wrestling, I've been struggling, I've been angry, I've been, you know, sitting, praying and asking God to just please, you know, just don't allow me to respond with my natural self. I'm growing in faith. You know, I always try to teach that we aren't natural beings searching for a spiritual experience. We're spiritual beings existing in a natural world. And so I've been reading through the book of Isaiah, and Isaiah 12, chapter 1 says, "You will say in that day, I will give thanks to you, O Lord, for though you were angry with me, your anger turned away that you might comfort me." And when I look at that, you know, of course we know Isaiah's prophesying that, you know, total destruction is going to come on everybody. Everybody, no one is going to be free from the wrath of God. Israel first, and then, you know, it starts with everybody else. The Medes and everybody else are going to get it, right? But however, it says at the end of it all, you know, God will turn his anger away and he will comfort us. So fear, anger, all of those things, all of those emotions are out of strife. It's out of an uncertainty. It's out of uncomfortability. And so we need to be comforted, right, in order to be at peace, okay, with whatever it is that we're wrestling with in our spirit. And I think for all of us, we need to model what God has taught us in this. And we need to, yes, I'm angry. I got a lot of reasons to be angry, you know?
Right.
You look at on the other line, you've got people who, for whatever you want to say, you know, the Confederate flag is part of their history. These statues, you got people that are taking trivial things and they're turning it upside down, and but yet they're marrying themselves to the opposition, right?
Right.
But there's fear involved and there's anger involved, right? But if we all were to turn our anger away with the goal of comforting the other side, right? Because that's what God has called us to do. You know, if we're to be leaders, we're leading in love. What is love? You have to rest in love. There has to be peace in love. There has to be joy in love. You know, that comes with, there has to be grace in love. You cannot love without grace. Like you can't. You just can't do it. And so if our agenda is to comfort, right, then everything else will fall under that umbrella. You know, education, healthy
Right.
conversation, change will come out of conversations like that. It's just unfortunate that no one wants to have those type of conversations. Right?
I think
that's true.
people really get, PJ, I was raised in a really structured environment, you know, my education, based on, you know, age difference.
Right.
You go here, you study this, you make A's. And then because you make A's, you're a good boy.
Right.
And you make A's simply by regurgitating what you've been told.
Mm-hmm.
And my challenge is in the fourth quarter of my life is now to take all that and actually realize it doesn't serve me well, and get involved in some different situations and have messy conversations that maybe don't have a convenient end to them. Like
Right.
I wrote a blog post this morning regarding this podcast. I wrote it in advance just to see how my mind would, I don't know. It was just an experiment. I'm always experimenting with words and ideas.
Okay.
And I realized that this podcast has great value,
Mm-hmm.
but it's a small piece of something much bigger. And there's no real end game where I can point and say, okay, three guys are going to get together in 40 minutes. We're going to declare an executive order and the world will be at peace. But PJ, I have to tell you, that's what I want.
Right.
I'm a C-level, you know, corporate suite kind of guy.
Right.
And when I would walk around and say to do things, hell, they got done,
Right. Mm-hmm.
even if they were bad ideas. And then I look at your story. Your stories are so wonderful. Your grandmother, she in this whole picture, I mean, I would say you're saint number 2. And I would say she's saint number 1 because she built bridges at the risk of her marriage. Do you realize? And how do we grab her heart and take it to our children and grandchildren?
You know, I think we just have to want better to understand. You know, you know, every kid learns, you know, the Lord's Prayer at the earliest of stages, right? You know,
Right.
your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That's a key right there.
Yes.
Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. When we look at heaven and we look at what we want, or what our strongest desires and what our strongest, you know, visions and hope for heaven is, it's a unified, peaceful life where we're all coming together, we're worshiping God. You know, there's no, you know, well, there's going to be this neighborhood over there, and there's going to be this neighborhood over there, and they're going to be singing gospel over here, but then we're going to have the whole, you know, Hillsong worship team over here, and then we're going to have the old hymns. No, we're singing in one voice, we're singing in one accord. And our desire should be to, you know, what is God's will? Is to grow his kingdom, right? How can we possibly grow his kingdom when there's so much division?
Yeah.
How can we have people on the Confederate side and people on the BLM side, both sides calling themselves Christians, but both being led by their natural feelings as opposed to their spiritual purpose? you know, and you know, I watched Malcolm X the other day, and he talked about how, you know, how Martin Luther King had it all wrong, and all of these different things, right?
Right.
How these peaceful protests didn't do anything, and it didn't mean anything. And you know what? There's definitely a time for shouting in the streets. I definitely believe that. But you know what? A lot of people don't recognize is that Malcolm X backpedaled toward the latter days, weeks, months of his life when he took that pilgrimage to Mecca, and he understood what the foundation of worship meant, what the foundation of believing in a higher power meant. It did not mean division. You know, there's generous justice. That's Tim Keller's quote. Amazing book. And there's a generous justice, yes, but justice cannot prevail if we're not leading with a Christ-centered biblical worldview. You know, we can rise up, and there's such a thing as righteous anger, but it has to be righteous. You know, the anger has to be righteous, and it has to be warranted, and it has to be targeted at the right place, and it has to, at the end, not just be an anger that's hell-bent on destruction, but an anger that's bent on change and on progress, right? And so that's I'm hoping once we're able to sift through the ashes of our current climate, that we'll be able to revisit the real core reasons of why everybody's so angered and hope for change. But right now, it's all being diverted. And it's like the ball in the three cups. It's like a 3-card Monte game going on right now. Let's distract you from the real issue. You know, keep your eye on it, but not really, because I'm going to show you something over here that's going to pull you away from it. I'm going to show you something over here that's going to pull you away from it. And that's really what's happening right now. It's sad.
Well, my contention is that love begins with listening.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I have really been convicted of the need to be a better listener.
Right.
And I've even practiced doing that by having conversations with people where I just listen and ask questions, and then when they run out of something to say, I ask them another question, an extended question. Is there anything else?
That's right. Mm-hmm.
You know, because pretty soon they're going to come to a place where they realize they're doing all the talking, and they're going to say, well, what do you think?
Mm-hmm.
And then they give us permission to share our thoughts and feelings, but we love them. We love them by listening to them and caring about their view and what they think. And so I've had a great time listening today. I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot. And if, for those of you who are watching today, if you want to learn more about, you know, following Jesus, because he was the greatest listener, but when he spoke, it really mattered.
That's right.
Because he did care about people. He did care where they were. And he did ask questions. I think of the story of the woman at the well.
Yes.
You know, how he approached her by asking a question. We've built into natural discipleship our process of coaching people how to do that, and giving some real practical, tangible ideas about beginning conversations and starting conversations that really matter. And so I want to offer anyone who's watching today a free copy of our natural discipleship student guide. If you will just go to powerpointministries.com, and there's a place there for you to check a box and or click a box or press a box if you're on your phone. We will get your basic information and we'll send you that document free. PJ, I want to thank you again for your generous time this morning and your incredible insight. And we love your stories, bro. We love
Oh,
your stories.
stories are so powerful.
They are. They are. Yeah.
Thank,
God has
thank,
blessed me with a colorful life. I'll tell you that. So never a dull moment.
thank you for being with us today, and God bless you, brother. I've enjoyed our time together.
I want to thank you both. I thank you for your willingness to listen. Thank you for setting this all up. It's been a great time. I appreciate it.
Good.
All right.
Thank you,
Thank you
everybody.
too, Alvin.
God
Bye.
bless,
Okay,
gentlemen.
bye.